everyone, and welcome to the Western Heritage Center. I'm Kevin Cloister, the Executive Director, and I realized that Laura and I actually had never met, which is odd when you're on the phone and going back and forth and watching Zoom programs. She said I'm taller than she thought I was. Anyway, she will be using a stool today because this stand here was designed by me, so it works very well for somebody who's 6'3", but anyway. So we're really pleased that Dr. Arata came here all the way from the Oklahoma State University.
That was close.
Wow. And she is a public historian specializing in the American West and has obviously a deep interest in the Montana Vigilantes and the story of Sarah Bickford. And so has put this together. I've actually seen her program, and that's why I invited her to come. And the book is the first nonfiction book, Western Writers of America, listed as a Spur finalist for Best Biography, and I don't know how to say Gita Chaturya Prize for the Western Association of Women's History Publications. And the book was published about 2 years ago?
2020.
2020, so she's out of the pandemic, at least she's traveling through Montana, did programs in Cody, will be at the Montana Historical Society in Butte. Was supposed to do a program last night at the Carbon County Historical Society, and instead ended up sandbagging all day. So welcome to Montana. So anyway, without further ado, Dr. Laura Arata.
Hello. Thank you so much. I feel like my little perch here. This is great. I've been talking at different places all around Montana for the last several weeks, and like every setup is a little bit different, so you never know what we're gonna get. Well, thank you. As Kevin said, I've been headed around. I was in Bozeman and Cody and Red Lodge, and I know everyone, like we're all thinking about Red Lodge as they start working on recovery. It was really amazing to see the town spirit and everybody coming together, and my back might never be the same, but yes, they did help fill some sandbags, and I hope that was, at least a little help to Red Lodge. It was an honor to do that. So I'm really excited to talk about Race and the Wild West, which is my first book, and it's a true story about someone who I think is incredible. And I'm going to work on drawing a few connections in this talk between the world of Sarah Bickford and then also the world I grew up in and the world we all know and love is the Wild West. And I'm happy to answer questions at the end. Like, I know we have a time limit on this, but I can stick around. So just to get started, does everybody know who this is? Looks familiar. He was in there from my talk at Cody, but I was going to talk about him anyway, I assure you. So he's a well-known figure, right? You don't get to know about the Wild West without hearing the name of Buffalo Bill Cody or having some ideas. Like, can anybody remember the first time you kind of heard the name of Buffalo Bill and started thinking about all those great adventures and all those great stories that we associate with Buffalo Bill as part of the Wild West? Because I do. That's what I grew up with, those kinds of legends. And I want to talk about him in connection with Sarah Bickford. Has anybody heard of Sarah Bickford? Who's heard of Sarah Bickford? Got a couple nods. There's a couple of you that I could tell anything right now and we would make it work. So part of the journey of writing Race in the Wild West for me was really kind of exploring why I had learned about one of these histories but not the other, right? I'm grateful that I've learned about Buffalo Bill, and Buffalo Bill actually pops up a lot in Race in the Wild West. You can't write a book with that in the title without talking about Buffalo Bill. But there's other stories that are harder to find, harder to write, harder to learn about, and so I had to explore that as I was writing this book. And it is the first full-length biography of Sarah Bickford. There had been a couple little things written about her before that. But I always like to start talks about Sarah Bickford by just acknowledging what was available when I first came across her story. I'm actually going to show you a picture of it in just a minute. The first time I walked into a building on a main street in Virginia City and saw a mention of Sarah Bickford, it was on one, literally just like an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper like this, and about half of it had a little biography of her. So it was a lot, you can imagine, to dig up enough sources then to write a whole book. So we'll talk about that. And I was very honored. It did win the 2021 Spur Award for Best First Book from Western Writers of America. I'm particularly proud of that one because that is like a general audience award. It's not an academic book award, which is a little bit of redemption for reviewer number 2 who looked at my book for University of Oklahoma Press, who said, and I quote, "Well, it's a good story, but this book is far too readable for an academic book." And I said, "Thank you. Take that." So, again, we know who this is. This is familiar. We all on the same page? We know who this guy is? Yeah? Anybody gonna be brave? Say it. Buffalo Bill, Bill Cody, yeah. So we know who this guy is? Oh, good. Every time people think about it for a little too long, you're like, no, you don't. This is my grandpa. His name was John Orada Jr., and I have to start here with this story because I always want to make sure people know I grew up on a working ranch. Okay? I grew up on a working ranch in Central California. We raised cows, we cut hay, and raised grain. So my summers growing up were very much that rhythm of growing things and baling hay and sewing grain sacks. And all those kinds of things that really, I don't always meet a lot of people who have lived through similar experiences unless I'm out somewhere like in Montana, and then I meet lots of people who can relate to those experiences. But I always want to make it clear that I'm starting the story about Sarah Bickford from that perspective of having grown up out here, and this is literally the ranch that we lived on. We didn't have TV. We had like 3 John Wayne movies and some Roy Rogers shows on videotape. And I think Hopalong Cassidy, there was some Hopalong Cassidy in there too. So that was very much my view of what the West was and what the Wild West was. And I grew up with all these very deeply nostalgic ideas about what that meant, that I was from part of the Wild West. And now all of you should be able to take a wild guess who this is. Good job, Kevin. Yes. This is me in my very last rodeo, and that horse threw me into a fence right after that. My back has never been the same, but that was our best time. So we retired after this. But so I grew up, living, immersed in this world. So I'm going to talk just a tiny bit about the history of Montana. I assume there's folks in this crowd who probably know quite a bit about the history of Montana, so I'm going to go pretty quickly, but I'm happy to answer questions at the end if there's anything I don't get to or that remains unclear, and then we'll get into Sarah Bickford. So it's a pretty familiar story. As we head into the 1860s, there's Dakota Territory, which is massive, and it's still unorganized at that point in time. In March of 1863, Idaho Territory split off from that because there's been a gold discovery in Bannock, and all of a sudden there's people rushing out to this area, and it's just kind of unwieldy and hard to control. In May of 1863, there's another gold discovery, a bigger gold discovery in Alder Gulch, which becomes Virginia City, and then about 12 other little cities down that sort of line of the river. And so then Montana Territory will be split off in 1864, and in the midst of that, and sort of that moment in between, we get the Montana Vigilantes, and we have this really big territory with a lot of newcomers in it, a lot of uncertainty, and of course, Congress creates this territory in 1864, and then did what Congress does best, and they adjourned, forgetting that maybe criminal codes and some things would be needed to keep order there. So there is this kind of really interesting unsettled period early in Montana's history before that first territorial legislature comes together in 1864. And then right after that, Virginia City will become the territorial capital, of course, and it will hold on to that designation for 10 years, until 1875 when Helena takes over. So as like most people here probably know what Montana looks like. Not all of my audiences do, but Virginia City's, kind of down there close to where the Red Star is, southwestern Montana. Who's been to Virginia City? There's only like a couple of you that I need to urge to go to Virginia City. That's very exciting. It's an amazing place to visit, truly. So here it is in 1866 when it is the boom town of Montana Territory. I love this picture because this is pretty much like all of Virginia City fits in this frame, right? We have our main street right down the middle, and then the building that's going on all around it, and it's like the biggest settlement in the territory, which really gives you some perspective, right, on just how fast things are happening, but also this is still a place that is isolated and is still really having to be pretty self-sufficient in a lot of important ways because there's not a ton of infrastructure that's made it in yet. So Montana Vigilantes, who's familiar? So I know where my Vigilante fans are at. So it's a famous story, and some of you maybe have driven around Montana and seen I always am curious when I'm traveling around Montana where I find little vigilante trinkets and knickknacks and things that are memorializing the vigilantes in forms of things I can buy. Coffee cups, golf balls, pins, stickers, magnets, they're all over the place. So what we're going to be talking about here, and this is a bigger movement, right? The Vigilantes are a bigger movement than just where Sarah Bickford enters the story. But what really enters race and the Wild West into that story is that there's a concentrated series of executions that take place mostly in January of 1864, including this final one at the bottom here with George Lane and Hayes Lyons and several others, where there's 5 people who are lynched side by side from a beam in an unfinished building on Main Street in Virginia City. And that's important because the building's still there. Who's been to Virginia City and been to the Hangman's Building? Anybody remembers being in the Hangman's Building? I mean, it's notable when you're there. And so we want to talk about why Sarah Bickford comes into that story. And just as a note, so lynching has, of course, a much broader and a much more complicated history than I'm going to have time to talk about here. It's worthy of a whole other discussion. There are some historians who argue that this initial core, there's 22 vigilante lynchings in 37 days, and if you take that as one episode, where it's the same group of people and kind of the same group of targets, that this is, by some accounts, the single bloodiest. There's some historians who have contentions with that. But it's certainly a notable event in the history of Montana Territory. But I have always been curious about how that translated then into tourism. Because the first time I came to Montana, vigilante tourism was everywhere. You can still drive if you go out, I forget which highway it is off the top of my head, but the Vigilante Trail is marked where vigilantes went. You can find little road signs that are marked identifying that. That trail was actually marked well before things like the Nez Perce Trail, which is marked, right, identifying the flight of the Nez Perce and their path in 1877. So I love this quote from 1864, which appeared in the New York Herald. So it gives us a sense of how New York is talking about what's going on in Montana in 1864. It says, "It's the fate of all mining countries that the first pages of their history have to be written in blood." Right? And what a Wild West story. I mean, what do we think of when we think of the Wild West? Your shootouts in the streets, right? Your gunfights, your good guys going after bad guys. All kinds of things that Buffalo Bill Cody would have found very relatable and translated into his shows for audiences to understand, right? About what it took to survive in this place and some of the ways it happened. So that leads us into just a little bit of Virginia City's history. It's called the social city for a long time. It gets that nickname because it's the biggest city in that part of the territory. When Yellowstone is opened up as a national park, starting in 1872, Virginia City is the place where you go to outfit your wagon or your camper outfit or get horses or supplies, whatever you need. It's also the biggest city that has places where you can go eat at restaurants or go to a gambling hall or find prostitutes or any of those things that we imagine in kind of a jumping, right, Western boom town. So it's nicknamed the social city for a long time. Here's 1868. You can again see that main street in the middle, and it's still a happening town, but this is the whole town, right? It really gives us some perspective. 1885, this is a quote that I use in everything I've ever written about Virginia City because I love how dramatic it is. In 1885, the first history of Montana Territory was published, and it's this massive, like 1,200-page history of everything the author could find that had gone on in Montana. And there's a quote in there from a contemporary who says, "Virginia City's been spoken of as dead and crooning over the embers of departed glory." And I think Virginia City probably had some things to say about that. Virginia City is still very much a place that is alive and still is, right? Still the seat of Madison County. But it really gives you a sense of the drop-off that happened, the decline that happened after it loses the territorial capital. And that comes out in Race in the Wild West in what I call the tourism of decline. So you get a sense, just one more picture. This is Main Street, Virginia City, about 1884, so about the time that history book comes out. And you get a sense, we still have unpaved streets and some pretty, right, kind of rough and tumble buildings. Like if you look at the roof on this building that's all the way over on the left here, you can tell they've been just kind of keeping things patched along. And you might compare that with somewhere like a Helena, right? A city that's grown up a little bit faster at this point. So here's May 2007. This is my first time in Virginia City, so I'm going to tell you just a little bit about how I came across Sarah Bickford's story and then got very interested in writing about it. I had just started grad school. It was unbelievable to me that I was going to grad school. I grew up on the ranch, extremely poor. We really didn't talk about going to college. No one in my family recently had gone to college, and so it was kind of an adventure, just figuring out what I wanted to do. But I had the chance to go on this field school and go hang out in Virginia City for 2 weeks and learn from the old buildings and learn a little bit about the history, which you can see me doing there. And this was kind of my first impression of Virginia City, walking down the street. And I fell in love with it immediately. I immediately felt a connection to this place. I wanted to go back to this place. I did go back later that summer, and then the next summer and the summer after that. And I think one of the reasons that resonated so deeply and that I was so just captivated by this place is because to me it felt like I was walking back in time into exactly what I had grown up believing the Wild West was supposed to look like. Right? I grew up in Central California. San Francisco was like 40 miles away. The Silicon Valley boom was just starting when I was a kid. So it was this weird dichotomy of, I lived on a ranch. My grandpa that you saw in that earlier picture was still like farming fields with a team of horses when I was a little kid. We have pictures of me out like planting pumpkins with him and like giant team of work horses. We didn't have TV. We had like a rotary phone that was on a party line for a lot of my life. Some of you can remember the party line. But then our next door neighbor flew to work in a helicopter every day. So it was this very odd, like, I wanted to live, you know, the way we had always lived with our horses and our farming and things we were doing. And the world felt very much like it was encroaching on where we lived from there. So Virginia City felt like a place to me that was authentic, where I could see this Wild West that was kind of already gone in a lot of ways in California, if that makes sense. So into the Hangman's Building, a couple of you said you've been there, so just a couple of quick pictures to kind of walk us through what it looked like when I first showed up. This is that one single page, that one single 8.5 by 11 picture that talked about Sarah Bickford. The very first time I went into that building, you can see it's only got about a paragraph of information about her. And that paragraph basically said she was probably born in slavery. She had several children who died when she first got here, but then she married another man. They owned the water company. She ran the water company for a long time. By the way, her business was in this building. Okay, there's probably a story there, and there's probably especially a story there. So this is inside today. You can see they have it kind of set up with her desk, and there's a stove and some other things that are, echo it being the water company office. But then you're going to find a lot of vigilante stuff. There's a lot of memorials and things that talk about different vigilantes. This is Captain James Williams, who in and of himself has a really interesting, kind of side story. There's some more materials talking about who the vigilantes were and what they did. And there's a little diorama that's still there, and this is still there today. If you drive to Virginia City tomorrow, or next Sunday, I'll be in Virginia City again next Sunday. There's this little diorama, that shows you sort of what was happening on this morning of January 14th, 1864, when these 5 men are lynched side by side. And this is clearly an event, This is an event that stands out in Montana memory and in Virginia City memory. And here's just kind of another angle, So you see from the front, here's the little false front that we'll see in the front of the building in a second, and you kind of get a sense of how the space is laid out behind it. And in the background of all of that, I was always struck by this. There is a mannequin, representing an African-American person, and it didn't have a lot of interpretation, but then there's all this vigilante stuff, and they're not connected, but somewhere in there they are connected because Sarah Bickford owned this building. So I walked away saying, okay, there has to be a story there. And I was immediately told, cool, there probably is, but you're never going to be able to write a book about that. Just give it up now. So I ended up writing on, here's the beam. So, if you go into it, it's very sobering. You can see this beam. You can still see the rope burns on this beam. And it truly is one of those places where you go and you can really think about what happened there and think about the history. So I decided I was in love with Virginia City. I wanted to go back to Virginia City as much as possible. While I was in grad school, I wrote my master's thesis about Virginia City. You can see I definitely pulled on that quote. I called it Embers of the Social City, which I'm still very proud of. And that master's thesis was an interesting journey. It ended up being about 300 pages long. Master's thesis is usually about 80 pages long, so my advisor loved me by the time I got done with that. And Sarah Bickford ended up in a footnote. That was the only information I could find about her was on that one little page. It was one paragraph of information, and I couldn't fit her into the rest of this entire story that was about business and how Virginia City survived through those difficult years after losing the territorial capital. So I finished my master's degree, and someone had suggested that I get a PhD, and I was like, those are for smart people. You don't understand. I'm a tiny redneck. I grew up on a farm in California. I'm not qualified for that. But then I was still thinking about it a little while down the road, and I realized this footnote was pissing me off, How could I leave this amazing story of Sarah Bickford in a footnote and not at least try to tell that story? So I ended up reaching out when I had gone to undergraduate school. The very first class I ever took, just as a happy coincidence, was History 101 with a historian named Quinard Taylor, who is an African-American person, and he was at the time, and we could probably argue still is, the preeminent historian of African-American history in the West. And I had taken History 101 with him. He didn't remember me. He declined to write me a letter of recommendation for grad school, but that's okay. The past is the past. And I reached out to him and said, okay, I've applied to a PhD. I want to write about Sarah Bickford. Do you have any thoughts for me? Some people are telling me it's going to be really hard. And he was very encouraging. He sent me all the information that he had. He'd managed to write about 2 pages about her in a book by that point. And just, kind of a side note, because I forget to say it if I don't say it now, but Quinard Taylor is actually the series editor of that book, Race in the Wild West. So what a cool full circle kind of a story. So I'd like to think that taking his class kind of opened me up to just history that I hadn't learned about before. But it was a journey. So I'm just going to talk really quickly about that journey, and then I'll wrap it up. So there were kind of 2 comments that characterized writing this book. This is the first one. You will never find the sources to write that book. And this is a composite said to me by several people over several years as I was getting started on my PhD. And a lot of times it was said with really good intention, right? People who said, well, it'd be great if you could write that story, but you're just not going to find a lot of information about her. And a lot of the information that I did have were these little kind of snippets, right? So this is a newspaper advertisement, and you'll see the name on here is Sally Brown, proprietress. So that was one thing I had to start getting in the mindset of, that she'd been married to someone whose last name was Brown, and she went by Sally, which was a really common nickname for Sarah at that time. So I really had to go looking for her, and I mean, this is cool. This is from 1880, and it gives me a sense. She's running a little restaurant. She's making pies and cakes, and she's serving the community. She's probably there's probably like a boarding house that's attached to this. But how do you write a whole book about it? Okay, she ran a business, and that's interesting, but it doesn't give me enough to write a book. Well, here's one discovery. So we just had a census not too long ago, right? In 1860, there were 2 censuses. There's the Schedule 1, which is the schedule of free inhabitants of a given place, and that's what you see here. That's how we think of a census today. It records your name and your age and your occupation and everyone in your household, and it's accounting, right, of who lives in the country. In 1860, there's still a separate Schedule 2. And Schedule 2 is the slave census that's been used for the last several cycles. They've been taking censuses of the United States. Schedule 2 did not enumerate people by their names. Schedule 2 only counted an age, a sex, a color, black, mulatto, etc., and a dollar value. And so Schedule 2 was really meant to just be a record of property keeping. So when I walked into an archive in Knoxville, Tennessee, and said, hello, I am looking for some information on this woman who I think was a slave around the Knoxville or Jonesboro areas. I think I know what family she was, owned by. I have questions. And you just kind of see the light drain out of this archivist's eyes for a little bit. Like, this is going to be one very disappointed young human that I'm helping. But we had this incredible discovery. So this is Schedule 1. And I did a lot more work trying to, think about why this might have been the case. But for whatever reason, the census taker for Washington County, where Sarah was living at this point, decided that he was going to enumerate every slave that was living in that community on the census. And he did that, and I know he did that here, because you can see we've got this list of names over on the left, and then there's an age, whether they're male or female. He's recorded race, right? You can see that column 6 is race, so black, white, mulatto. And then right next to it, he's made himself a little extra column, and he's written an S next to it, which I can assume means slave, because you see someone else has crossed it out. It's all the X's. And I know it's hard to see in this image of it, but someone's written Schedule 2 in the margin right next to it on the left. And if I look at this list, about halfway down, I don't know where the point is. There's probably oh, there we go. Okay. Here's Sarah Blair, 8 years old. And this is, I think, the Sarah that I'm looking for. So all of a sudden, now I've got a place to start. I've got a family. I've got an area that I can explore. And this actually becomes a cool, like, early Wild West story. Sarah Blair was owned by someone named John Blair. John Blair was a United States congressman, and John Blair did not get along with Davy Crockett. They were bitter political enemies from Tennessee. When Davy Crockett gets up and tells everybody to go to hell because he's going to Texas, he's probably looking at John Blair. They are not best friends. So all of a sudden, then I start thinking about, okay, well, like, what stories is Sarah growing up kind of hearing echoed around her? Because being from that part of Tennessee, she probably heard about Davy Crockett heading off to Texas. And it created kind of an interesting backstory. So now I know, right, from finding her on the census, how far she's traveled. After the Civil War, she leaves Knoxville, Tennessee, and she heads all the way up to Virginia City. So this would have been a long journey at that time. And her journey getting to Montana is a whole other interesting story. I'm going to skip it for now, but I'm happy to chat about it later. So the other comment that really shaped writing this book, and this is the one that stayed with me, is from another advisor who said, you know, I can tell you really care about her. And I was kind of lamenting at that point, like, I don't know, maybe I just quit. I don't know if I'm going to find enough sources to write this whole thing. But she told me, you know, if you care about it that much, keep looking. And there's a real turning point I just want to talk about for a second here. So I was doing some other research. I'd put Sarah Bickford aside for a minute, and I was writing an article about tourism based on the Montana Vigilantes and the Nez Perce War. And it ended up being called Terror and Tourism. And I wanted to look at how these events that are really terrifying at the time when they're happening, right? Things are scary when the vigilantes are going about rounding up people and executing them. Things are scary for Montanans when they know the Nez Perce are moving through Montana and they're not sure what's going to happen next. So I wanted to look at that process by which something that was like a terrifying event at the time then becomes fair for tourism. So how does that transition take place to a point where I can go look at it then and feel comfortable that I'm looking at these sites? And so you see up here, this is 1877 is when the newspaper was from. Nez Perce War is in 1877, so I'm just like mopping up, doing some extra research at this point for that article. And I happened to stumble across, right? This is an obituary, and you see the bottom one. In this city, Monday, December 24th, 1877, James Leonard, son of Mr. and Mrs. John Brown, aged 2 years and 6 weeks. That's all it says. So I know this little boy has passed. And so the first I know, okay, is this the same James Leonard Brown? Because nobody knew the names of Sarah Bickford's sons from her first marriage. And he was able to pin that down. There weren't any other families with similar names in the census. I was able to find some other corroborating evidence. So then all of a sudden what this meant is that I'd found this little obituary and I was able to give Sarah Bickford's son back his name. Right? He died when he's 2 years old and no one had talked about his name. And for Sarah coming out of slavery, I think that would have been really significant to talk about his name. But the other thing that stuck with me about this is you'll see his date of death, right? It's stated here that he died on December 24th. One of the things I always knew about Sarah is that she considered her birthday to be December 25th. So all of a sudden now, this is a really important story about the tenacity of this woman and what she's gone through, and just what a human, heart-wrenching story, right? To lose your 2-year-old the day before your birthday. You're living in this place. And just to kind of, put that in some perspective. So that's 1877. Here's the 1880 census. And you can see Sarah right here. She has one daughter who's living, and that daughter is going to die, tragically, not long after this. But she gave her age as 24 years old. Right? So then all of a sudden, it puts it in perspective. I was about 24 years old at this time. I thought, well, if Sarah could go through all that, she's lived in Montana, she's lost her first husband, all 3 of her children have died, she's running these little side businesses to try and support herself. She chooses to come back to Montana, and somewhere in there she comes to own this building where all this tourism happens. If she can go through all that, I can find a way to tell her story. So we've been on this journey ever since. So just really quickly, And you can read more about all of this in the book. The first decade of her life in Virginia City is really tragic. She marries a man named John Brown. He's an Irish immigrant. According to her divorce proceedings, which we were able to turn up, he was really severely abusive. She wins a divorce in 1881 on the grounds that he has been severely abusive. She's got a couple of years in there where she's kind of living on her own with her one remaining daughter, and then that daughter dies. So there's all these things that are happening. And then it gets much happier. Her next decades go much more smoothly. She marries another man, also a white man named Stephen Bickford. He's from Maine. They have 4 children. All of those children live and outlive them. It's a much happier story. And then Stephen acquires ownership of the Virginia City Water Company, which he leaves to Sarah when he dies in 1900. So in 1900, she becomes the first Black female public utilities owner in the nation. I can't find another example that's similar to her. And in 1917, she buys a building that's since become known as the Hangman's Building. She's going to operate her water company office and tourism out of that building up until her death in 1931. So here's Sarah and Stephen, just to give you a sense. We don't know a ton of details, like intimate details about their marriage, but it does seem like they had a partnership. They had a really strong partnership with each other. They supported each other, various business ventures on both sides. Stephen Bickford never quite gives up mining, and Sarah Bickford is always doing something else to supplement their income. I think maybe one of the ways I really identified with Sarah is when I learned that she was raising chickens and raising fruit and raising vegetables and selling those around town, selling eggs and butter. And those are like things I remember doing with my grandmother when I was growing up, raising chickens, and we actually did make butter, and packaging up eggs to take around. So that was very relatable in terms of her story. And so it brings us into just a couple of final notes on this tourism of decline, because I always joke about it. I thought the Vigilantes would be like a couple pages in this book, and they took over my book. You can see them. They're in the subtitle now. But they are a great story. The Vigilantes are such an interesting story, and they're like one of these episodes, right, that really characterizes how early Montanans think about the place where they're living. So the tourism of the Vigilantes in Virginia City has its own interesting story. 1864, these 5 men are lynched. They're buried in unmarked graves because, of course, why would you waste a perfectly good grave marker on someone who's been accused of highway robbery and murder and all kinds of terrible things? They're not going to do that in 1864. But by 1907, we're just starting to get into the early stages of more independent tourism in the form of automobiles, right? And better roads are starting to come to Montana. More and more tourists are showing up saying, I would like to see where this happened. I've heard about this famous episode. Where can I see the history? So in 1907, James Walker is the mayor of Virginia City. He's like, you know what? I will deliver on what the people are asking. I'm going to dig up those 5 graves, and we've got to identify who's buried where. Accuracy. And the only way they can do that, because it's been a while, dead road agents look pretty much the same after they've been buried for a long time. It's like the way we're going to do that is we're going to dig up the one who was known as Clubfoot George, because he had a club foot, and that will be distinctive. So he heads up there. He takes A.B. Davis, who's well known in other circles of Montana history for lots of different things, certainly one of the founding fathers of Montana. So they go up there together and dig up these graves. And it's an important part of marking the Vigilante Trail, right, which is coming through. Virginia City is an important stop, of course. So famous story. They find all the graves. They mark all the graves. These are some of the older markers that are in the Thompson-Hickman Museum now, and there's different markers, but they've been marked continuously ever since. And maybe some of you have seen this. The next thing he does is bring down a foot, and he puts the foot on display in his curio cabinet in the courthouse, as you would. I think it would have been less weird at that time than we might think of it now. But the foot stays on display for the next 100 years. This is the picture I took of the foot the first time I showed up in Virginia City. And I was like, odd, but okay. If it's the history, I want to learn about it. And so this is a pretty recent development. Some of George Lane's family members came to Virginia City, I think in 2017, and we're like, could we not keep this on display, though, actually? And it was a whole, big discussion, and you've got to give people credit for coming to the table and like talking about this kind of awkward and challenging issue of having this body part on display as a relic. And so they ended up cremating the foot, and the ashes of the foot were scattered at George Lane's grave, and now there's a 3D printed replica of the foot, and there's a lot of feelings that are inspired. And just, I have to share this with you, like it just happened, I'm still thinking about it. So I gave a talk in Bozeman last week. A lot has happened since last week, but there was a gentleman at the talk, and we were having a lively debate about the Vigilantes, and it was really interesting. He had some ideas that made me think about things, and we were going back and forth chatting about the Vigilantes. And then he says, well, one other thought. I'm actually a hand surgeon, so I'm very familiar with extremities, right? I spent a lot of my career working on extremities, and I don't think that's a club foot. I think that's just a foot that they brought down there and put on display. The debate will begin, right? So, I'm not an expert in feet. I have no idea about what an interesting wrinkle to the story, and now I have more questions. So, just very quickly, right, to wrap us up, this tourism of decline, because it does take off. Some notable things happen as Sarah Bickford is running this company, right? 1890, famous date, the American frontier is declared to be closed. That's the first time that the census enumerates people across the country, right? And it's a big moment. It makes a lot of Americans really anxious. Throughout the history of the United States as a country, we've been pushing into this frontier. What are we going to do now? Now that it's closed, what's the next, right? What does the next chapter look like? And that's that beautiful, complicated nostalgia that someone like Buffalo Bill manages to jump in on, right? And offer to preserve a part of it in a way that other people can go see it all around the world, whether they're in New York City or London or Paris. And so it's like capturing a moment, right? When there's all of a sudden this growing nostalgia for this place that it's feared will be gone. And there's some other important developments, right? The highway system is developed after World War I, and then again after World War II. Automobiles become more available. Americans are starting to travel and see the country in that way more. So there's the real growth of this tourism, especially with places like Virginia City that can say, hey, we're an authentic part of that Wild West. If you want to come see it, don't go see it somewhere where it was created. Come see it in Virginia City, where it always was. And there's just one story that kind of highlights how popular this history is becoming. 1918, Mary Pickford is one of the most famous women in America, right? The silent film star. She's been in a ton of movies. And the newspaper reports that she spent a day traveling through Madison County, viewing all the historic sites on her way to Yellowstone, and that she stopped in Virginia City and saw the historic points. One of the few historic points that's open in 1918 is the building that Sarah Bickford has purchased as her water company. And there's a rumor about her time in that building that says she would keep a coil of rope under her desk and snip off little pieces, and when tourists would come in to see it, she'd be like, authentic, part of the rope, 10 cents, which is very entrepreneurial. I've never been able to prove this story, but I could see it happening. And so I like to imagine that there's a moment there when Mary Pickford walks in and Sarah Bickford is like, yes, hello, would you like to buy some rope? I have things to do. How can I help you? But it's interesting to think of them having crossed paths. So I get a sense here, these final couple pictures I'm going to show you are from 1939, and they were taken by a photographer with the Farm Security Administration, so was working on behalf of a New Deal program documenting Montana. And there's amazing pictures of a lot of Montana communities in that collection if you're ever curious, and they're very well done, and they're all available for free on the Library of Congress archive. But you see here how they're billing it, right? Virginia City is the cradle of Montana's history. So this moment where Montana is brought into being because of the actions of the Vigilantes and because of, right, this very interesting, colorful history. Here's 1939. We can see, this is that same reel of film. Sarah Bickford's original signs identifying who was hanged here. And you can just see it. There's her little office, Virginia City Water Company sign. And they've put a shinier new sign on top of it now to mark it as the Hangman's Building, which of course it's still called today. And there's another image in this reel, like just to highlight how popular this tourism is. And I just always like to throw it out there as things for us to think about, because this history is alive and well. Right? Vigilante history in Montana is certainly alive and well. This is 1939. The same photographer, as he's driving around Montana, captures this image of an effigy. It's an effigy, right? It's not a real person. But that's been hung. You see his notation. Cattle thief hung in effigy along US Highway 10 to provide Western atmosphere for tourists. 777 refers to secret password of vigilantes in 1864. You'll see it more commonly as 3777 now, but I mean, you'll find that in a lot of places, including Montana Highway Patrol. I think it's still like part of the emblem of the official, right, Montana Highway Patrol, which just really gives us a sense of how deep, right, the connections to that history go. And I find it fascinating that even in 1939, this is something that's encouraging tourists. Right? You know how it is, you're driving along and you see something you're not expecting on the side of the road and you're like, I am turning around now, I will go investigate. And I imagine that was very effective, right? And especially for tourists who want to experience an authentic, right, part of the West. So the way we do that might look a little bit different now. But I love this quote, right? History's relentless. Once made, it cannot be unmade. I haven't been out to see it yet, but right, if you've been to Virginia City, there's living history, and one of the living histories that's reenacted pretty regularly in Bannock is one of those vigilante lynchings of Henry Plummer, who's the sheriff. And there's still great debate. Was he guilty? Was he not guilty? We don't know. It's one of the things I don't know. People are always trying to pin me down on if I think Henry Plummer was guilty. I have no idea, but it's a great story. And, you know, so just the retellings of this story have taken on some interesting lives of their own over the years. But I'll leave you on what I'm most excited about is a happy note, other than being here to share this with you for the afternoon. And thank you all for coming, by the way. We've just finished filming a little documentary with the Extreme History Project and North by Northwest Films out of Bozeman, about 4 different Montana women who were interesting figures in their time and influenced the history of Montana. One of them is Sarah Bickford, so I was really excited to come and talk about Sarah and talk about these vigilante tourism connections. And it is really important to note, she saves this building, right? It's owned by actually someone who was a vigilante in 1864, the time she buys it, and he's talking about tearing it down. He's talking about how we need a fancy new hotel, and maybe we don't need this like sad old building on Main Street in Virginia City when she buys it. So she really does preserve the history and the legacy of this building. And here's our living history performer walking in. So that's coming. I'm supposed to get to see a preview of it next week, hypothetically. So I just want to close on this final note, right? Because it can seem a little bit disconnected that we have this history and legacy of someone like Buffalo Bill, and then we have, right, this separate history of someone like Sarah Bickford, and then what seems like yet another separate history of, this is my grandfather holding my father at a couple months old. In California, you can see the barn behind him actually, on the ranch I grew up on. But there's a thread through all of those histories, right? There's a thread from Buffalo Bill straight through to how Sarah Bickford viewed herself as saving part of this history, and how someone like my grandfather viewed himself as living, right, in the aftermath of that history. And sort of the common thing that draws us all to the idea of the West and the story of the West is that, just very deep and ingrained feeling that no matter who you are, even if you're someone like me who grew up in the middle of nowhere in California and decided to get a PhD, or you're someone like Sarah Bickford who started off with absolutely nothing and ended up in Montana and built your own business, someone like Cody who also starts off with nothing, right, when he's a child and then becomes one of the most famous people in the world, that the West gave us all that opportunity to be someone, right? And that's a powerful legacy. So I hope this book inspires just more conversations about ways we can expand that legacy and all these different stories that are bound up in it that maybe we didn't get to hear about before, but they're there now. So that's all I got. I'm happy to answer questions. Thank you again so much to Kevin and everyone here for having me. Thank you all for coming and spending your lunch hour with me. At least a couple of you had tasty food that I was kind of jealous of, but I hear Kevin's buying me lunch now. So, any questions? Just gripping that microphone really tight. Any questions I can answer about absolutely anything? Kevin.
She bought the Hangman building and is promoting the Vigilante kind of story and lynching. How is she finding balance in that story? Do we know?
It's such a great, it's one of the central questions, right? I really had to wrestle for a long time in that book with. At the time she buys the building, they're not calling it anything. It was like a drugstore for a long time. I think it was the post office for a little bit. Most recently, before she bought it, it was a barber shop. And that beam had actually been covered up. This is one of the things that tells me a lot about Sarah as an entrepreneur. She's the one who puts a trapdoor in the ceiling so she can have control over who's looking at that beam and when. And I think it's a really interesting story. It's one of the stories that is kind of uncomfortable at the surface level, right? I remember saying that to one of the archivists at Montana Historical Society when I was first getting started, that, it's an odd story. She's a Black woman promoting tourism at the site of a lynching, and I need to understand why. And it's not like she left me a piece of paper that says, here's why I did this. She didn't leave us any of those sources. But the more I learned about it and the more research I did, it really seemed to me, the way we think about race, the way we think about ethnicity and belonging and all of those really complicated things change for each of us individually, right? They're not set in stone. They're individual to all of us. And I think she was able to find a place for herself there where she was part of that place. And she knew that she had connections to that place that she might not have found anywhere else. She does travel back to Tennessee a lot, actually, and she's certainly aware of, right, the racially based aspects of lynching that are making the news a lot in that time period. But my suspicion has always been that she has reasons that maybe she thinks positively about the vigilante legacy. One of my suspicions is that they ran her first husband out of town. He wasn't nice to her, and that seems like a reasonable, I'm never gonna have a source to prove it, but there's some circumstantial evidence that makes me think that was the case. And so I think once we get past the initial discomfort of why is she a Black woman promoting tourism at this site, and just step back and see it as another really interesting story of the Wild West. And Sarah Bickford is someone who was saying, I'm going to participate in this too. I found this place for myself. I mean, just what interesting ways to open up how we think about who's participating and creating those legends. Yes?
When I was doing research on Billings Black community, there's a lot of crossover with Helena and Great Falls. And she pops up periodically. It sounds like there's a lot of bragging about her achievements. But am I correct in seeing that she's not actually traveling to interact with these organizations? It doesn't seem like she personally shows up in Helena or Great Falls at events, but I'm just getting small pieces of news. But they do seem that the community does seem to talk a lot about her achievements. But I got the feeling that she was somewhat disconnected from some of the other communities.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I know the most about her interactions with Butte, and she certainly does travel to Butte. And her daughters have friends that live in Butte, and like they'll come stay with the Bickford family for a week, or her daughters will go to Butte and stay for a week. I don't know as much about how much time she spent in other places, but she certainly did travel around the state. I could see her kind of, popping in and out and then using the excuse of, well, I need to get back to running the water company, so I'm not gonna stay very long. But she is certainly self-aware of what she's doing. Like the best source that I have for that, this is a great one. It was in a 1920 publication from Chicago called The Light and Heebie-Jeebies. That was the name of the periodical, which is just so fun in 20s, right? Where she talked to a reporter and said, I'm the only person of my race who's doing this in the West. I'm the only one I know of who's running a water company. And The Light and Heebie-Jeebies is a periodical that probably went out to Butte and Helena and Great Falls and was, kind of circulating through towns that had more formalized Black communities. Right? 'Cause Virginia City really doesn't. It's just a few residents. The Light and Heebie-Jeebies, which was kind of short-lived, but it did talk about her. And there's some other interesting, so when I was researching, it was like Laura stuck in the basement of the library with a microfilm machine for many, many, many hours a day. And then, of course, as soon as I was wrapping up all that research, the internet decided that everything would be digital. Now you can just search for it. And I was like a little too bitter at the time to do a ton of additional research. But I do need to do a follow-up at some point about something. I mean, we're always learning new things. I hope there's way more things to be written about Sarah Bickford that I didn't find yet. So that was a long answer to a very good question. Anything else? A couple of you are yawning, need a walk, understand completely.
You have 3 copies of your book up here.
Yes. Some copies in the back. I have some more copies in the car. If there's a run back there for some reason, I won't complain. But thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited and grateful to have the opportunity to travel around Montana these last couple weeks. And I hope you find this story as interesting and inspiring as I do. It's a great human story, and it's such a cool part of Montana history. And I hope the love and the attachment that I have for Montana comes through. It's really been my honor to spend a lot of time here. Thrilled to be back this summer. So, thank you.